Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. One thing I've already noticed, as we say in Arabic after the first session, I'll say about Dr. Taha, malaiktu hadra. His angels are around us. We feel him all around us. So I feel uplifted, actually, and not sad, uplifted by this meeting. I'm honored today to give a keynote address about a major contemporary Islamic scholar, leader, and a very good friend, Dr. Taha al-Alwan, whose legacy I cannot really give adequate recognition of, but I will try to tell you how much I know and also to speak from the heart. Our American Muslim community has been blessed by the distinguished leadership of a select group of dedicated American Muslims, male and female, who are no longer with us. And we have mentioned some of them. I'd like to add, for example, Sharif al-Khatib. Maybe one day we should have something about him. Among them, Dr. Taha was a towering figure. He was a prolific writer and an outstanding thought leader with an admiring international following that I often encountered during my travels. People would tell me, take this book to Dr. Taha, or give him my salams, or all the way from Pakistan to North Africa. You know, this person was very much loved, as his daughter said. Dr. Taha was a scholar's scholar and an Islamic visionary who understood both the true soul of Islam and the depth of the Ummah's crisis. His command of the Arabic language was superb, and it gave him clear advantage in understanding, properly evaluating, and critiquing complex texts. At the same time, his writing style was crisp and accessible to the average reader. He was not one of those who tried to make it complicated so that he looks like he is very smart. We already knew he was very smart. He didn't need to do that. Dr. Taha's major contributions are many. Among them is his rejection of the sanctity of traditional Islamic jurisprudence as distinguished from the divine wahi or revelation, and his call for re-evaluating this traditional jurisprudence in light of modern needs. He was also instrumental in reviving the thought of various ancient scholars, such as 14th century scholar al-Shatibi, we talked about al-Razi, and there are many others, and his theory of maqasid al-Sharia, the objectives of Islamic law, which provided a solid interpretational foundation of the Quran. And of course, we also spoke about his contribution to understanding the relationship between the Sunnah and the Quran. Furthermore, he wrote important treatises on fiqh al-awlawiyat, jurisprudence of priorities, which is really quite important. I don't discuss it much here, but it is very important in a more international setting as well. We can talk about it another time. And fiqh al-aqalliyat, jurisprudence suitable for Muslim minorities in the diaspora, which some of you call fiqh al-waqi', I would call it fiqh al-ahwal, because it is about how circumstances change and how for those changed circumstances, some of the established fiqh will have to be readjusted and revisited. He topped all these intellectual accomplishments by engaging in praxis, which is the putting his theory into practice, which is, by the way, what I'm also doing with KARAMAH. Praxis is very important in Islam. He implemented his religious and jurisprudential beliefs in his daily life, even his parental practice. In the rest of this talk, I shall expand on the matters mentioned so far to give you a better understanding of how important Dr. Taha's contributions were to our community and also to the world. In his book Maqasid al-Sharia, Dr. Taha argued that Muslim scholars should have engaged more vigorously in critiquing their own tradition over the centuries instead of leaving that task to others, for they were more qualified to do so. He noted that some of the barriers that hindered jurists from engaging in such critique and discussed them. Among them, this is how sensitive he was and knowledgeable of culture and language and so on. He said among those barriers was the cultural respect for elders, the wish to preserve ijma' or consensus in the community. These are important values in jurisprudence and in Muslim communities that hindered free discussion. The former barrier, that is, being careful about critiquing the elders, was intertwined, according to him, with the unfortunate view that such critiques constitute an ad hominem attack on the scholar and not merely a critique of his views. He understood that was not the case, but culturally, unfortunately, many people took that view and it hindered the discussion. Where is Ermin now to say that his comments this morning would have pleased Dr. Taha, because he understands the value of the back and forth. The second barrier was intertwined, the second barrier about ijma' was intertwined with the view that any critique was divisive to the ummah and harmful to its unity. We even hear this today, okay? In critiquing these barriers, Dr. Taha resorted to the purest of traditions, that of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who encouraged free ijtihad, a critical jurisprudential activity that more often than not leads to differing opinions. In fact, as we all know from the prophetic tradition, a person who engages in ijtihad and reaches the wrong conclusion will also be rewarded by a hasana, right? A reward for having tried diligently to find the right answer. For in Islam, it is better to think and be wrong than not to think at all. We're not automatics. So trying to preserve unity of the ummah by suppressing critiques of the tradition is not the Islamic way, not the prophetic way. Negative attitudes towards the internal critique of the tradition led to intellectual stagnation in Islamic jurisprudence and the resulting age of taqlid or imitation. It also discouraged freedom of expression. Had this freedom been respected, as it was during the days of the Prophet, difference of opinion would have been mainstreamed in society as normal and desirable. Furthermore, those with opposing views would not have had to resort to forming parties and sects. Dr. Taha correctly emphasized in his analysis that the proliferation of sects and parties was not the result of differing opinions. Rather, it was the result of the demise of freedom of expression that permits vigorous dialogue. That's something we really need to think about today. Much of his thought is something we can still benefit from, a great deal. This last observation about free expression is quite insightful. We know that freedom of expression was prevalent in the days of the Prophet. How Muslims are we? That's what I'm trying to say in this lecture. It was prevalent in the days of the Prophet. Not only did he speak of hasanas for those engaged in jurisprudence, as I already mentioned, there is a whole surah in the Quran which recounts how the Prophet engaged in dialogue with a woman who disagreed with him, right? What's the name of that surah? Thank you. Elsewhere in the Quran, we are told that the Prophet was sent to us to deliver glad tidings and warnings, mundiran, mubashiran wa nadira, but not to control us, not as a musaytir. In other words, he did not come to impose his beliefs on us. And by the way, neither did Dr. Taha. He was very open to discussion, right? So if the Prophet himself had no divine permission to dominate us in our beliefs, how could anyone else impose such dominion over us in the name of Islam and discourage, even punish others who insist on exercising their freedom and expressing their own views? And in this, you might think of it as an example of the takfirs. Who gave them that authority? An authority that God did not give to the Prophet. This is the crux of the intellectual mihna crisis in Islam. We still have memories of the great Imams Abu Hanifa, Malik, Al-Shafi'i, Ibn Hanbal, and Ja'far al-Siddiq, to mention a few, each of whom suffered a severe mihna caused by his beliefs. Dr. Taha added the example of the great scholar Al-Razi, who asked his students, maybe I should too, to bury him secretly at night so that his opponents would not dig him out and disfigure his works. We have to face our problems. We have to face our wars. He spoke about it. Look, we've been silent too long. Why do you think we're here today? I mean, here, the whole ummah at this age of ISIS. How did we go from the freedom of expression of early Islam to intolerance, even vengeance, and the harsh imposition of official uniform thought of later centuries? One answer, according to Dr. Taha, is the political system, which capitalized on other barriers to develop a new jurisprudence that became subject to its interest. We all know that. How did they do that? By jurists who were subject to the power of these political systems. Many jurists who resisted worldly pressure ended up in jail, if not worse. By the way, I want to say something off the cuff about Dr. Taha, because I mentioned all the four Imams and Ja'far al-Sadiq, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, is that in his writings he always mentioned both Sunni and Shia scholarship, something I'm not qualified to do. He obviously was extremely qualified, and he was bridging the gaps and going over them to discuss the basics of Islam. How did we go from the freedom of expression of early Islam to intolerance and all that? Because of the political system. Dr. Taha was quite right. The political systems that flourished after the passing of the Prophet and the four rightly guided Khalifas were deficient in two respects: democratic governance and conflict resolution. Freedom of expression does not flourish in a vacuum. It is organically linked to other freedoms, such as freedom of religion, that Islam also guarantees. Indeed, these freedoms are part of the grand architecture of the Islamic worldview that rests fundamentally on the concept of Tawheed, or the unicity of God, and the values that this one God propagated across the universe. Among these values is the fundamental equality and dignity of all human beings. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. It didn't say كَرَّمْنَا the Muslims, or the male Muslims, or whatever, white Muslims. لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Everybody God created with a dignity. These values are best realized in a shuratic state, a state based on shura, or consultation, and also based on bay'ah, which is the ancient form of choosing a leader, with an independent judiciary answerable to God and not to a despotic ruler. So it should come as no surprise that such a state is described in the Quran. And two of my early articles were in the 90s were about democracy in Islam. Unfortunately, however, the shuratic state was not given the chance to blossom after the death of the Prophet. That's a whole other discussion I'm not going to get into. But in modern terms, this state that the Quran talked about corresponds to what we loosely call today a democracy. And I say loosely because I'm not sure how much of a democracy has remained of it. Many modern Muslims rejected the conclusion this conclusion because according to them, the democratic state represents the will of the people, but an Islamic state represents the will of God. I'm sure you've heard that critique of my kind of statement. However, this argument suffers from a real ontological and conceptual categorical mistake, and I shall tell you why. For when Muslims elect their leaders, the resulting state will represent the will of the people. That is true. However, to the extent that the people themselves freely choose to submit to God's will, this makes the democratic state an Islamic state par excellence. Why? For its citizens would have exercised their freedom to twice. Freedom to choose the leader and freedom to choose taqwa or piety without being subject to coercion of leaders. And that's really the pure state of Islam, where Islam is not forced on someone, but they choose it. So the mere fact that people choose their leader does not mean that we are now in a state that is un-Islamic. To the contrary, because those people are now also choosing Islamic law and Islamic belief. And that's where piety comes in, and they have had exercised Islamic principles twice in this case, and therefore it is an Islamic state par excellence. In this regard, it is important to remember the signature call of Islam, Allahu Akbar, which has many meanings. I'd like to note that God is great is not one of these meanings. Right? The correct answer is God is greater. But that raises the question, greater than what or whom? This is where different interpretations arise. A common one among the people, Muslims, is the following. God is transcendental presence. There's none like him. Having established that, we also go on to say he is greater than the most powerful oppressor on this earth. He drowned the Pharaoh's armies in the blink of an eye and could do the same to any oppressor on earth today just as fast. So the call Allahu Akbar reminds us that God's compassionate justice will always have the upper hand, whether on this earth or in the afterlife. For all these reasons, this call is a liberating call to justice, freedom, and human equality. It is an impetus to democratic governance based on taqwa, not an authoritarian governance based on oppression or an act of violence and terrorism, as we have heard recently. As I mentioned earlier, the post-Al-Khilafah al-Rashida era was deficient in two respects: democratic governance and conflict resolution. I have already refuted the fallacy in the argument that what we call today democracy is un-Islamic in broad lines, in structural lines. As to conflict resolution, we have in the Sunnah of the Prophet many valuable examples. In fact, the first such example happened when he was still quite young. History tells us that Al-Kaaba burned down and was rebuilt before the advent of Islam. Meccan tribes then argued over who was going to put the blessed black stone in its proper place in the Kaaba structure. The conflict was heating up among the tribes. So the young Prophet Muhammad, who was known for his honesty and who had not yet received the message, was chosen to solve this problem. So he proposed that the tribes put the black stone in the midst of a robe and have their chiefs carry the robe together to the Kaaba. Once there, he lifted the black stone to its proper place and a serious tribal conflict was averted. Had Muslims studied this and other examples of conflict resolution by the Prophet carefully and developed its jurisprudence adequately, the Muslim world would not be in its current state of fighting each other. Unfortunately, it is clear from reviewing ancient history that many Muslim leaders were deficient in their conflict resolution skills, and that this deficiency is still with us today. The bloodbath around the Muslim world today is only a recent example. This is not to deny that some differences within the Muslim world across history involve pivotal doctrinal matters, but it is to argue that openness to conflict resolution could have avoided a bloodbath in most cases. This is most notable in the historical battle of Karbala. So I'm following Dr. Taha's example and bringing some other stuff here. According to Al-Akbar al-Tiwal by al-Danawari, who was a 9th century Sunni scholar, historian, when faced with this conflict, Al-Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet, attempted repeatedly to resolve it with the Umayyad generals to avoid bloodshed. He made several proposals, such as offering to leave to the borders where he would fight the enemy. Fearing Al-Hussein's stature in the Ummah, none of his proposals were accepted. The result of this failure to resolve the conflict peacefully has divided and devastated the Ummah till this day. Think about it. In other words, we still are in grave need of developing conflict resolution skills, and it is time to acquire them and heal the schisms across the Muslim world. Incidentally, one Muslim sect, surprisingly, that has actually taken conflict resolution very seriously is the Ismaili sect, and especially in the area of family problems. Especially, they did this in Africa and in Canada. The rest of us could learn from them. One more fact, it is for this reason that when we at KARAMAH teach Islamic law, we couple it with a module on conflict resolution. By the way, Zainab is a member of the board. So part of the compliments go to Dr. Zainab Alwani for her work at KARAMAH. Dr. Taha recognizes that there have been also external barriers to the blossoming of ijtihad. The dark age of colonialism made a critique of the tradition more difficult, he says, for it became imperative for scholars to defend the Islamic tradition against outside attacks that tried to obliterate it. He is right, and there is more. For example, the French colonialists in Algeria closed all madrasas, and with them the study of the Arabic language, thus creating an unbridgeable barrier between Muslims and their Quran and their Hadith. As a result, generations of Muslims learned about Islam from every other source except the Quran itself. Many lost that personal close link with the Quran that Dr. Taha speaks about. Ultimately, knowledge of Islamic law and values receded and was often replaced by culturally and politically motivated religious rules that are problematic. With Islam under severe attack, it was very hard to engage in reformation, although some scholars, Dr. Taha mentions, like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, did. After colonialism, many parts of the Ummah lived through the stage of quasi-independence that we continue to live in today. We lived through the stage of quasi-independence and foreign-imposed authoritarian rule, displacing all Quranic teachings to the contrary. Many jurists, even muftis, became employees of the state. I remember my grandfather, may God rest his soul in peace, rejected the call for him to be named the Mufti of Lebanon, because after independence, the Mufti would take his salary from the government. And he didn't think that was right. Thus, religious authenticity and taqwa waned in the face of these adverse developments that combined to ultimately usher the new grand fitna we live in today. It has turned Islamic values and symbols on their head and left death and destruction in its wake, all in the name of Islam, our beautiful religion. Today, we have armed extremist groups that violate every overarching Islamic principle, from that of Tawheed and Adala, compassionate justice, to Rahmah, mercy, and the dignity of human life. They do this in the name of Islam. Some of our youth around the globe follow these Pied Pipers to their certain death because they love Islam and do not know any better about their religion. Often, our children learn Islam from the cultural perspective of their parents at home, the distortions of neo-Orientalists in school, and partially qualified imams at the mosque, not to mention the highly biased media. We, the educators, the jurists, and the social leaders have let them down. Except for Dr. Taha, who was trying even in his hospital bed to continue teaching. We did not do our job of teaching them about the truth and beauty of our religion. We did not give them the intellectual armor to protect them from enemies masquerading as friends. Today, we pay a bloody price. Another important critique provided by Dr. Taha about the decline of jurisprudential activity and our knowledge of Islam rests on the fact that for centuries, jurists buried themselves with the juz'iyya, particulars of their religion, and forgot about the kulliyat, or universal, overarching principles of their religion. As a result, new issues were examined from a limited partial perspective that may have been suitable for other times and places, but not for our modern realities. This deterioration in juristic wisdom led to a neglect of the important role of kulliyat in understanding the Islamic worldview within which all laws, including al-juz'iyyat, must be situated. It also made it easier later for Muslims and non-Muslims to engage in equally academically reprehensible approach of proof texting in attacks and counter-attacks on Islam. For those who don't know proof texting, somebody picks a verse from the Quran and says, look, this is what it shows, and the opponent says, oh, but I have another ayah which shows the opposite, and so it becomes a war of ayahs. Where is the overarching principles of Islam? Where is the spirit of Islamic thought? Where is the reality of Islamic thought? It's all lost with this lack of knowledge of how to situate the particular within the overarching principles. These are some of the deficiencies and maladies that Dr. Taha addressed in his writings, reflecting the urgent need for reformation. His reformation ushered a brilliant revival and recombination of the various methodologies devised by earlier scholars in order to develop jurisprudence suitable for our times, as well as for our place, the United States of America. In this effort, his and my intellectual paths have converged. Let me summarize Dr. Taha's approach. To understand Islamic law, we have to understand first the grand architecture of this world to know how to properly situate derivative principles within them. Principles, laws, and even particular rules need to fit within that grand architecture of principles, such as the grandest being at-Tawheed, right? That is the core of all such architecture in Islam. And therefore, for example, when I'm asked to go give a lecture somewhere and I want to build a position, I always start from Tawheed. Because regardless of how different opinions Muslims hold in a gathering, they all start from Tawheed. So we can all start with the same point that we all agree to. According to Dr. Taha, from this foundational principle emanates two major principles, those of tazkiyah, self-purification, and umran, building civilizations. Both these emanating principles presume two divine gifts, namely our free will and istikhlaf, vicegerency on earth. These two gifts give us the ability to choose to live the virtuous life of tazkiyah and to choose to work diligently for Umran, or to choose the opposite. Yet, our choices cannot be haphazard. They are based on the characteristics of this material world that God has created in which He situated us. So how do we know what is the right thing to choose? How do we guide our steps in life? We have fitra, human instinct, which tells us don't kill, for example. Don't steal. Maybe that's a later fitra. But God gave us a sacred book that helps us navigate the moral and material challenges of this world. The Quran thus becomes a major reference point in our lives on which we base our worldly as well as our heavenly knowledge, reasoning, and decisions. This is a major point that Dr. Taha drives home repeatedly in his discussion, Al-Jami' Bayn al-Qira'atayn, combining the two readings. What are these two readings? Or two items that we need to comprehend? The world and the Quran. According to Dr. Taha, combining these two readings or studies or comprehension is critical to bringing about tazkiyah and Umran on earth. For otherwise, how will you find your way? At this point, I cannot help but compare my approach of divine architecture of this world with that of Dr. Taha, so I hope you'll allow me to indulge a little bit in that. One paragraph, no more, I promise. We both assume free will and the gift of istikhlaf. We also both start from Tawheed. But then Dr. Taha takes an activist approach, stressing what we ought to do on earth, namely tazkiyah and Umran. He goes directly to the point. On the other hand, I go on to derive from Tawheed the principle of al-mizan, the scales and balance that governs our universe. Indeed, and you know, as you know from the Quran, because there is only one God, there is only one, He chose that principle. If there were many gods, we would have conflicts. So God chose that principle, al-mizan, to govern our universe. Indeed, God tells us repeatedly that He has created this universe according to precise calculations and due balance. Just think of Surah Al-Rahman, for example. This balance is reflected in human society in the principle of adala, or compassionate justice. These scales, and is the key to promoting harmony in society. But adala does not happen haphazardly. It requires a detailed knowledge of a situation as well as good understanding of Quranic guidance. By combining these two readings and choosing to promote adala, we achieve at once tazkiyah and Umran on earth. So Dr. Taha and I both start from the same core principle of Tawheed, yet using different paths, we end up in the same place. Turning back to Dr. Taha's work, we note his important work in the area of maqasid al-sharia, and in this part of his work, he revives the tradition of judging acts and determining rules in light of their objective. The objectives of sharia is to promote our well-being on earth. However, utilizing this method of analysis risks sinking into error through subjective evaluations. Because you can sit and write and tell me that I see the maslahah is this, when your view of the maslahah is biased by your subjective interests. How do we guard against that? For this reason, jurists develop dawabit, criteria that govern the use of this method. Among them are, for example, determination of whether the matter under consideration indeed involves the desired objective in question. Or, another way, another dhabit, examination of the priority of the objective. That's where fiqh al-aqalliyat also comes in. Or furthermore, assessing it in light of both its positive and negative consequences. So don't mention to me only what is the maslahah, the interest in choosing that maqsad, I want to know also what goes wrong and then balance the two to find out where I should head. And finally, combining considerations relating of the particular situation to those relating to the overarching principle. These are some of the dawabit to make sure that what we are developing is not a selfish, subjective maqsad, but something that will serve the general public. These are only some of the safeguards a jurist needs to observe in order to ensure that she is on the right track, you and me, and other women. The last safeguard is quite important for Dr. Taha. He notes that as Islamic thought declined, jurists became less knowledgeable about the grand architecture of Islamic principles and limited their work to refining the particulars they inherited. When faced with new problems, they again assessed those not in light of the grand picture, but only with respect to these particulars they were familiar with. They didn't have depth in the knowledge of Islam. This led to impoverishment of the Islamic juristic tradition and a slew of erroneous and also harmful results. This critique gains special importance in light of another part of Dr. Taha's work, Fiqh al-Aqalliyat, or jurisprudence of Muslim minorities. Given his deep knowledge of Islamic jurisprudence, he could readily recognize some of the worst offenses of modern Muslim jurists who stuck to fatwas and rules of times past without looking properly into the situation at hand or the maslaha interest that the Sharia was supposed to serve. He argued that new questions should be evaluated in light of the grand architectures of Islamic law and its objectives. Go back to the fundamentals. Don't just take the latest fatwa and build on it because you are too lazy to go back to the original reasoning and principles. Mere imitation of past jurists will not do. Here it's important for me to bring forth the classic Islamic juristic mantra that rules change with time and place. And we talked about that in the morning. So you remember Shafi'i, who went in the same era from Iraq to Egypt, found out that by changing the place, the jurisprudence needed to be revised. This is not something we are introducing today. This is something that is part of the tradition. Yet there are many examples in Islamic history where this rule was applied as well. Jurists continue, regardless of these examples, to be sanguine about imitating ancient scholars, taqlid. It is hard to see how our world can still be guided by those who never had a phone, a car, or a securities market. Lazy, imitative jurisprudence is dangerous in a world that has changed so drastically since medieval times. It can backfire and produce harmful results. Furthermore, while circumstances have changed drastically in Muslim majority lands, the change in circumstances, al-ahwal, is even more drastic and more urgent for Muslim minorities in the West. An energetic and insightful jurisprudence is necessary that reconsiders issues anew in light of grand principles and local circumstances. As it turns out, God gave Dr. Taha exactly that opportunity to put his theory into practice. And I'll talk about that now. In 1997, I turned to Dr. Taha for help in a major crisis engulfing the Muslim community. Our organization, KARAMAH, had invited the late Justice Scalia to address a select group from the community on the First Amendment, on the first freedom of our Constitution, and the first freedom is really religious freedom. The event was held at the Supreme Court building, and some of the Muslim visitors took tours in the Supreme Court room. I think it was about the first time ever that Muslims visited that building, and they were acquainting themselves with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court room is adorned towards the top with a marble frieze wrapped around its four walls, depicting lawgivers throughout history, including the Prophet Muhammad. And I know there is a paper here somewhere. And so I'd love to read your paper and listen to these historical comments. One Muslim organization, which shall remain unnamed, raised the objection that such representation of the Prophet was a graven image prohibited in Islam. It demanded from officials of the Supreme Court to remove that image through sandblasting, and actually it said, or else. There was a threat to the Supreme Court made. The discussion with the Supreme Court officials was becoming quite heated when I found out about it. It was my judgment that the representation of the Prophet was quite generic. It was not an attempt to depict him exactly, and is a bas-relief, that is, it's a raised engraving. It did not amount to a graven image as defined by Muslim scholars. So I took it upon myself to resolve this crisis and stop the potential catastrophe that was going to befall the Muslim community based on what has happened until that time. The organization I mentioned also objected that the Prophet's representation reinforced false stereotypes about Islam because he was represented as holding a sword and a book. And they said, oh, so we're saying Islam is violent. That's one reason also to sandblast the image. In fact, the Prophet was also holding a book, and the Supreme Court architecture, I had to talk to the architects, had an important symbolism embodied in all these friezes, not only in the Supreme Court but around Washington, that the organization was not aware of. This is where minority issues come in. In all its depictions, this architectural committee that was responsible for the buildings, the sword represented worldly authority. In the Prophet's case, it was a reference to his political leadership of Medina, and the book was the Quran. So it was not an attempt, 18th or 19th century attempt, to present to distort the Islamic image. The Muslim community the immigrant Muslim community that was new in this country did not understand the symbolism of the Supreme Court. I contacted both Dr. Taha and Seyyed Hossein Nasr about the situation and asked them to provide me quickly with an opinion to clarify the true Islamic position on this issue. They both understood the situation immediately and agreed that no Islamic law was violated by the frieze. And I got those opinions like within 2-3 days. The support of the late Dr. Shima of Chicago, may God rest his soul in peace, and Imam Warithuddin Muhammad, may God rest his soul in peace, their support was also instrumental in ending the crisis because they represented the thoughtful, non-religious leadership at that time. Armed with two Islamic opinions and the support of all these extraordinary men, I was able to put the revolt down and end the crisis peacefully. That's conflict resolution. But Dr. Taha did not stop there. He had given me a short version of his fatwa in time to avert the crisis. Now, he said, he had to develop the fatwa fully and present it to the Supreme Court. He wanted to make sure that the Supreme Court understands that Islamic opinions or fatwas are serious intellectual products based on a wealth of legal tradition and precise reasoning. About a year later, that's how long it took, the fatwa of Dr. Taha was ready and translated into English. We made an appointment together and went to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, we had wanted to meet Chief Justice Rehnquist. He was not available. And we handed the fatwa to the officials to transmit it to him. In the opinion, he points out the cultural significance of the frieze representation and the vast difference between it and that of Jahiliyyah days, where they were worshipping idols. He also looked to the intent of the representation, namely to honor the figures in the frieze. They wanted to honor the Prophet Muhammad as a lawgiver. Furthermore, he looked into ancient tradition to articulate the prohibition of engraven images more carefully and illustrate that this example was not prohibited. In other words, He did exactly what he advocated, both in Maqasid al-Sharia and Fiqh al-Aqaliyat, to reach a wise conclusion that fit our time and place and took into account higher Islamic principles as well as cultural barriers. This is an art. Incidentally, for those who are interested in this opinion, I did have it published in a special issue on Islamic jurisprudence in volume 15 of the Journal of Law and Religion, which appeared in the year 2001. And there, that was right after 9/11. And I had a zillion jurists call me and ask me if we had set this up so that it would come right after 9/11. And I said, you should really know how long it takes to edit a journal issue, and then you would not be asking the question. Having said all this about Dr. Taha, I think there is no need to tell you that he was blind, gender blind. I never heard him make any sexist statement or any offensive statement of any kind. When it came to jurisprudence, we had great conversations. He never patronized me personally or intellectually. And you know, I can smell it 10 miles away. I really can. In fact, he often sought my legal advice, and at one point made me his official advisor. He was critical of patriarchal men and sought to enlighten them gradually, the philosophy of the Quran. Most importantly, he left behind 2 accomplished daughters. And I know a son, but I want to talk about the daughters, Ruqayya and Zainab, who are jurists in their own right. And you heard from Zainab about how he took the time and effort to make sure that she learned from him. That is a great model for a father and a jurist. Dr. Taha was a humble and pleasant person with a healthy sense of humor. I'll leave you with the jokes. We shared several lunches in his office with Sabir, our friend, over kebab and rice. And then life was much simpler than that. In short, Dr. Taha was a class act, as a person and as a jurist. May God rest his soul.